Flora Franks was beside herself. Her son Bobby never came home from school. The Harvard School for Boys was only a couple of blocks away, and it wasn't like him to not at least check in before he went out. She called across the street since he regularly played tennis with his cousin Richard. Richard's mother, Anna, hadn't seen the boys since before school. He was going to the University of Chicago now. He'd graduated from the boys' school already. Richard was most likely out with Nathan, she said. He was most days. When Flora's husband, Jacob, got home, he thoroughly searched the neighborhood. He wasn't as frantic as Flora. He reminded her that, although it was unusual, it wouldn't be the first time he was late. He was 14, after all. Teenagers can be absent-minded at times. And besides, they lived in one of the safest neighborhoods in the state, if not the country. The Kenwood neighborhood of Chicago, where this took place, was nothing but wealthy businessmen and their families. These were estates, large homes full of servants. These were the titans of industry of early Chicago. As the day turned to evening, Jacob became more and more worried. He tried to remain stoic, not to show fear to his wife, but he had that pit in his stomach that concerned parents know all too well. Jacob went as far as to get a hold of the headmaster and personally searched the school himself, but it didn't lead to anything. When he returned home to check with his wife, immediately he looked at her face and he knew things had gotten worse. While he was gone, she received a phone call from a man calling himself George Johnson. Johnson had their son, and he wanted $10,000 in old unmarked bills for his return, more than $100,000 in today's money. Little did they know, their son was already gone, and the killer was someone they knew. Welcome to History, Mystery, and the Unexplained, the show where we look at everything from true crime to cryptids, the paranormal, and beyond. Today, we're looking at the case that has been described as the crime of the century, or the perfect murder. But before we get started, please like, subscribe, follow, or whatever on the platform of your choice. And be sure to leave us a review, and I'd love to hear what you think. On May 22nd, 1924, Tony Mink had just finished the night shift at the American Maize Company. He was making his way home. He'd always follow along the path of the Pennsylvania Railroad to 120th and then cut over. This saved him about 5-10 minutes, depending on the weather. Otherwise, he had to go all the way around the swampy marshland near Wolf Lake. This particular day, his typical route was drastically interrupted. As he passed a culvert near 118th, he happened to glance inside. Something was obstructing the flow of water. It wasn't extreme, but it was enough that it was noticeable. Tony figured it was a rock or a log, maybe an animal who crawled inside. He finally saw what it was, however. He almost lost his lunch. It was the mutilated body of Bobby Franks. Acid had been poured on his face, and he'd been severely beaten. Police had little to go on. They had the body, of course, and with it, a pair of glasses. This was the only item of clothing that was found with Bobby, and Bobby didn't wear glasses. They were a very common prescription, a common frame, a set of horn-rimmed reading glasses with a 0.5 astigmatism. Unfortunately for the killer, however, this particular pair contained a patented hinge that connected the ear and nose pieces. Only 3 pairs of these glasses had been sold in Chicago up to this point. One to a woman with a different set of frames, one to a lawyer who was currently traveling abroad, and the third to a 19-year-old boy named Nathan Leopold. The same Nathan that was best friends with the boy across the street. Police spoke to Nathan, and it just didn't make sense for someone like him to commit this crime. Like Bobby Franks, he was a resident of Kenwood, a child of a wealthy businessman. At the age of 15, he was enrolled in university. By 19, he had his undergrad from U of C and graduated with Phi Beta Kappa honors. He was proficient in 5 languages and was studying another 10. He'd already been accepted to Harvard Law School. When asked about that day, he said that he was out driving with his friend Richard Loeb. They were cruising along Lakeshore Drive in his red Willie's Night car for the better part of the day. Richard Loeb, like his friend Nathan, was a child prodigy. He was a resident of Kenwood, entered high school at the age of 12, graduated at 14, and was the youngest graduate from the University of Michigan at 17. So how did Leopold's glasses end up near Bobby Frank's body? Simple. Nathan was an avid ornithologist. He even taught bird watching classes, and one of his favorite haunts was Eggers Woods Forest Preserve, where Bobby's body was found. The glasses must have fallen out of his suit jacket pocket at some point. A simple explanation. The day prior, the day Bobby Franks had disappeared, a man named Morton D. Ballard rented a car. The rent-a-car facility only catered to reputable clientele. They required proof of residency and at least 3 references. Mr. Ballard explained that he was new to the area. He was up from Peoria, a large city in the central part of the state, and he just picked up a new sales route in Chicago. He provided the attendant with a few letters from the hotel where he'd been staying, the Hotel Morrison, along with a bank statement from Hyde Park Bank, where he'd established an account. He only had one reference, a Mr. Lewis Mason, but the $400 he slid across the counter as a deposit quickly eased any additional tension the clerk might have had. They did, of course, call his reference while he was standing there at the number Morton provided, and Mr. Mason answered, offering a glowing review of his friend. The clerk gladly handed Mr. Ballard the keys to a simple blue Willie's Night 5-door sedan. He offered him an upgrade free of charge to one of their sports models, but the salesman felt that it was too flashy for what he had in mind that day. He thanked him for the keys and walked out. After a relatively short drive to a cigar shop on Wabash and 16th, he stopped the car. The number provided to the rental company, the one that they had just called, belonged to a payphone where Lewis had been waiting. Lewis hopped in, greeting his friend with a kiss. They had big plans that day. He had with him all the supplies they had purchased earlier, rope and a chisel purchased from 2 different hardware stores, acid from a drugstore, and a few rags. The men were excited to murder. They had no particular person in mind. They had a few candidates they'd seen in passing, but they wanted to know what it was like. They wanted to take life and feign a kidnapping. Not out of malice or need for money, but simply because they could. Because they believed they were the Nietzschean Superman. They were above morals or ethics. They prowled the streets of South Kenwood looking for a victim and came across young Bobby Franks walking home from school. They offered him a ride and he declined. The walk wasn't much, but after a bit of coaxing, he hopped into the front seat. Almost immediately, Lewis Mason was upon him, beating him with the chisel until he was unconscious. He then dragged Bobby's body to the back seat, bound and gagged, and covered him in a robe. He climbed up front with his friend, and the two simply drove till nightfall. At one point, they even stopped at a sandwich shop and got a couple of hot dogs and a root beer. They made a phone call from a payphone at a drugstore. Mind you, Frank's body was in the car this whole time. They had no remorse. They simply waited to dispose of the body like one waits for their turn in line, idly passing the time driving back and forth from Chicago's downtown to the Indiana border. When the sun finally set, the two carried the body to the culvert, stripped it naked, and doused it with acid. They then burned the boy's clothes and disposed of the robe along with his shoes and the chisel before washing up. According to their own testimony, they swung home and played a game of cards with the family and drove some relatives home in another car before sending out the ransom note with instructions outlining exactly how and where the money was to be dropped off. When the police checked the Morrison Hotel, there was no trace of Morton D. Ballard having ever stayed in the room. He was on the registry. He received mail there, and a suitcase had been placed in this room, but the maid noticed that the bed had never been slept in. In fact, nothing in the room had ever been touched, and the suitcase wasn't filled with clothes, as one would expect. It was filled with books from the University of Chicago Library. The police dug deeper and found that Morton Ballard didn't exist. Neither did Lewis Mason. So, who were they? Who rented the car and committed this heinous, senseless crime? It was none other than Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, Bobby's own cousin and his best friend. When police interrogated Nathan regarding the glasses, he said that he had spent the day with Richard driving around in his red Willys Knight sports car. The problem with this was that after they rented the other vehicle under their assumed names, they dropped off his personal car at his parents' house. The chauffeur told the police that Nathan's car was in the garage the whole time. This tiny loose thread was all the police needed to unravel the web of lies. Furthermore, one of the servants even helped clean up the blood in the back of the rental car under the guise that it was red wine. Because, teenage boys chugging red wine while driving around in the 20s was just whatever. Once the cat was out of the bag, the boys confessed to everything with almost a bit of pride for what they'd done. Again, they were believers in the Nietzschean Superman. They believed that they were without consequence. They weren't, of course. After a very public trial, they were both given life sentences plus 99 years. Loeb died in Joliet Prison on January 28th, 1936, when he was stabbed by James Day for allegedly making sexual advances toward him. Leopold served only 33 years of his sentence and was released. He moved to Puerto Rico and lived there till his death in 1971. That's it for today, folks. Till next time, I'm Christopher Grenois. This is History, Mystery, and the Unexplained. And thanks for listening.